Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 23, Brusilov's Offensive. The disasters which had befallen the Allies in every field during 1915 had forced them to a closer unity and more intimate consultation. Inter-Allied conferences from henceforward began to play a prominent part. Intense effort was made to survey the war as a whole and to concert joint and simultaneous plans. There was at this time a strong reaction against what were termed sideshows. For 1916, the supreme exertions were to be concentrated against the German fortified lines in the west. France and England were to assault together in the summer astride of the Somme, and Italy and Russia were to make great offensives at the same time. Thus, on every front, the Central Empires would be assailed. Falkenhayn's attack upon Verdun on February 21 disturbed these elaborate preparations. It was necessary for the French to carry a whole army from their northern sector to Verdun, and the gap had to be filled by an extension of the British front. It has therefore been argued by the Falkenhayn school in every army that his eruption and seizure of initiative in the decisive theatre was thus vindicated. No doubt, from the German standpoint, this result was in itself good, but much easier and cheaper methods of deranging the impending Anglo-French offensive were to hand. If Falkenhayn had wished to pursue as the main feature of 1915 a far-reaching campaign in the east, he could evidently have minimized his dangers in the west by making the same kind of retirement in April, May or June 1916, as Hindenburg and Ludendorff did when they were in control at the beginning of 1917. What was the use of all this French country, which had been acquired so haphazard in the flux of the first invasion, if it were not to be sacrificed or sold back to its owners for a sufficient price in time or blood? The suggestion that, but for Falkenhayn's attack on Verdun and the consequent weakening of the summer thrust by the Allies along the Somme, the German front in France must have been broken, is not one which can be accepted. As the winter grudgingly withdrew, the gigantic plans which both sides had evolved came into action. The Russians, indeed, both in December and March, made heavy, bloody and fruitless efforts with their northern armies. Their March attack near Lake Naroch seemed to be timed to catch the thaw, which at this season made the ground most painful to the infantry in assault and the roads impassable to the artillery and supplies in pursuit. The Naroch offensive, in which 18 Russian divisions were engaged and where new, abundant supplies of shell and heavy shells were used, was repulsed by the 10th Army under Eichhorn with a loss of upwards of 70,000 men. The surprise cannonade of Verdun reverberated throughout the warring world, and from every theatre all eyes were turned upon the Homeric combats which raged around Douaumont and Thiaumont and 304-meter Hill. The British hastened by every means the dispatch to France of all the Kitchener armies for the forthcoming offensive on the Somme. It was expected that by the middle of June Sir Douglas Haig would have nearly 50 divisions, representing the fighting force of an army of 2 million men, at his disposal in France and Flanders. The Russians, in that emulation of comradeship which was the characteristic of the Tsar's armies, concerted a new enormous onslaught. Their main attack, to which 26 divisions were assigned, was mounted on a 25-mile front to the north and south of the village of Krevo, in the neighborhood of Molodechno. In order to hold their enemies upon the rest of the line and prevent the transference of reinforcements to the threatened sector, the High Command of the Southwest Front was directed to prepare contributory offensives. General Ivanov had passed from the scene. He had been appointed to the Council of Empire, an horrific method of compulsory and final retirement from executive authority. In his place sat General Brusilov, whom the reader will remember as the leader of the southernmost Russian army in the Battle of Lemberg, now nearly 2 years gone by. Hitherto Brusilov, having always fought against Austrians, had borne all the tests of war. He will certainly go down in history as an officer of exceptional energy and comprehension. He was fortunate in having at the head of his 4 armies commanders of proved and real merit: Kaledin, Zakharov, Shcherbachev, and Leshitsky. All these men were fully abreast of the realities of modern war and accustomed to direct large operations. The Southwest Front, accordingly, set itself to study its subsidiary role. For nearly 5 months the Teutonic activities in the east had been in suspense. Apart from the 2 ill-starred Russian attacks, a very tranquil form of trench warfare with, as was remarked, scarcely 100 to 150 casualties a day, had smouldered from the Baltic to the Romanian boundary. The breathing space had been precious to Russia. Her armies had been refitted and replenished after the hideous retreat from the Polish salient. The crisis of munitions was broken. From now onwards ammunition, guns, and above all rifles were arriving in a growing stream. Our observer, General Knox, notes that nearly 1,200,000 rifles from the United States, from France, from Italy and Japan had reinforced the national production, now expanded to 100,000 a month. Meanwhile the ranks had been refilled and large numbers of unarmed men stood behind every formation, ready to relieve in turn the fighters of their rifles and their duties. The Russians thus contemplated resuming aggressive warfare upon the largest scale and throwing their whole front into full activity by about the middle of June. This general renewed onset from the east was to synchronize with the opening of the offensive of the Western Allies upon the Somme. Of all this formidable recrudescence, Falkenhayn and OHL were unconscious. Events were to precipitate the Russian attack. The drama of Verdun seemed to require from every ally of France competing sacrifices. But now, on May 15, Conrad re-entered the scene. He was triumphant after his borrowed victories in Galicia. For long weeks he had been pining for the snows to melt and open the hated Italy to his new offensive. We have seen how severely Falkenhayn had deprecated this diversion. The separation of the 2 commanders was final. In the mountains of the Trentino, across almost the same ground which British and French divisions were to stand 2 years later, Conrad fell upon the Italians with superior forces and all the best Austrian artillery, of which the Austrian front against Russia had been denuded. He made immediately serious headway in the general direction of Verona. Italy raised the alarm. The King of Italy telegraphed personally to the Tsar. The Stavka was moved to ask Brusilov whether he could do anything to take the pressure off the harassed ally. Nothing must, of course, prejudice the set-piece attack impending near Krevo. But surely some forward movement was possible which would prevent further withdrawals of Austrian troops from Galicia to the Trentino. Brusilov replied that his armies could just as well make such a demonstration at the beginning of June as at the appointed time 3 weeks later, when they were to have conformed to the main Krevo battle scheme. Brusilov was authorized to strike for what he was worth, it being understood that only limited results could be expected. It was this very derangement of the timetable that produced the greatest Russian victory of the war. By every maxim of military prudence, the Stavka committed an error when they compromised their prospects in the battle planned around Krevo by losing prematurely the offensive of their 4 southwestern armies. Yet it was this element of what is often called lack of clear thinking which imparted to Brusilov's attack the priceless quality of surprise. Moreover, Brusilov's plan was well made. All the four armies were to be launched at once. They were to attack without elaborate, noticeable preparation. A brief bombardment, only a single day, into which the ammunition of a whole fortnight's fighting was packed, was to be followed by a general incontinent walk forward of all the Russian forces along a line of nearly 200 miles. June 4 was fixed as the date, and the haste of the decision guarded its secret. At the signal, this broad though shallow battle burst upon the unsuspecting Austrians. Conrad, his gaze directed upon Verona, learned that all his eastern armies were ablaze. The next day the Russian infantry advanced. On the right, Kaledin carried all the opposing trenches, progressing 10 miles on a front of 30. On the left, Leshitsky was completely victorious. The successes of the two center armies were less sensational, but in the main the Austrian troops either fled or eagerly surrendered in great numbers to the enemy. Bohemian regiments virtually fraternized with their fellow Slavs. The resistance of the Austro-Hungarian armies was broken upon the entire front, and a gulf of 195 miles yawned in the eastern defense of the Central Powers. Brusilov's contributory attack, launched prematurely and unrelated, had achieved results far beyond anything dreamt of for the great Russian set-piece at Krevo. The Stavka showed itself capable of profiting by the gifts of fortune, and discarding all their long-cherished plans for the campaign, resolved to back the new success with every man and gun their railways could carry to the south. This transference of forces, hampered only by the meagre railways, was in full progress from the 9th or 10th of June onwards. Meanwhile Brusilov was advancing. In the month that followed, the armies of Nicholas II, which had hitherto suffered unexampled miseries with patient fortitude, whom their conquerors had almost dismissed from their calculations, captured above 350,000 prisoners, nearly 400 guns, 1,300 machine guns, and regained a tract of debatable ground 200 miles wide and in places nearly 60 miles in depth. These disconcerting tidings reached Falkenhayn at the most awkward moments. His attacks on Verdun had subsided into a prolonged concentrated struggle in the crater fields around the fortress. Each side crammed new divisions into the limited area of the death grapple, and fed their guns with unstinted shells. The Germans had performed prodigious. Douaumont and Thiamont and Vaux were in their hands. The possession of 304-meter hill was disputed with blood and assertions. But the world sustained only one impression, namely that the French held Verdun, and that impression was grievous to the German cause. For over 3 months past, there had been no question of an attack which could be broken off at pleasure. The prestige of the German army was engaged. The reputations of Falkenhayn, of OHL, and indeed of the unlucky heir to the throne were deeply involved. To gain some definite, indisputable success on this deliberately challenged battleground had become militarily and personally indispensable. Meanwhile, 100 miles to the north, all the new British army, 30 or 40 divisions of them, every man a volunteer, with powerful French forces on their right, were obviously about to make their greatest attack in measureless force. The whole region before the German Somme front was lined with batteries. And air reconnaissance showed the enormous accumulation of munitions and the close-up camps of nearly 1 million men. This storm was about to burst. Falkenhayn had gone willfully, to the west, and thus had he fared there. Neither the German Supreme Commander nor his staff was unequal to the occasion. They took the decision imposed upon them by events with cool and refined judgment. They yielded up their hopes of Verdun. They faced the approaching explosion on the Somme. They resolved to restore the Eastern Front. Wherever in this turbulent advance the Russian waves had encountered German troops, they had swerved as from a rock. Bodmer, with the Südarmee, its one German division, stiffening 9 Austrian, held his ground or receded slowly. Linsingen, opposite the extreme right of the Russian attack, covering Kovel, and the important railways running back to Kolm and Ivangorod, maintained a stubborn posture. Now from every side Germans must be brought to regather the Austrian hosts and reform the front. Hindenburg and Ludendorff must send 3 divisions, 2 more must be scraped from the local reserves, 4 must come from France at the very moment when they were most needed there. As for Conrad, caught in the act of having improperly and unfairly cast away the front which Germany had re-established for him, taken red-handed in the midst of an unwarrantable disconnected Trentino offensive, he must without compunction be brought under discipline. No more could the pretensions which AOK had indulged after 1915 be tolerated. Unity of command was the penalty which OHL exacted in return for their renewed valiant aid. Conrad's Italian offensive was immediately suppressed. Austrian divisions and Austrian artillery must recross the breadth of the monarchy and help to stem the Russian flood. Brusilov's great battle now turned upon whether the Germans could arrive to succor Austria at a greater rate than Russians from the north could sustain him. Here the Russian railways showed their weakness. Moreover, the very quality of being launched on the spur of the moment, which had favored Brusilov's offensive, now deprived it of nourishment. There was no deeply banked weight behind his attack. By the middle of July, the Teutonic front was again continuous. Hard fighting, with varying results, burned all along the southern line, but it had once again become unbreakable. Moreover, the great event had happened in France. On July 1, 14 British and 5 French divisions, with as many more in near reserve, had begun the Battle of the Somme. Although London and Paris were deluded or consoled by moderate captures of ground and prisoners, the general battle of the first day, never afterwards renewed on such a scale, was an unmistakable German victory. The French losses were not excessive for the results gained, but the British army, the flower of the nation, was mowed down by the German machine guns, and on the night of July 1 Sir Douglas Haig had to recognize his repulse at the cost of nearly 60,000 men. The Somme battle now devolved into an inconceivably bitter and bloody struggle of divisions and corps, representing nations rather than armies, in pulverized fields and villages. It became to the German staff a hideous preoccupation, but no longer a violent crisis. However, as it continued, the persistency with which, regardless of losses, the new British armies pressed forward over scores of thousands of corpses, and their vigor in the conflict began gradually to equalize the conditions. The German losses, at first disproportionately small, swelled savagely. All through July, all through August, through September, the deadly duel continued. In October it spread from the Somme to the Scarpe, and even at the end of November, when the full rigors of winter in Picardy were added to the most intense horrors of war, Sir Douglas Haig was still possessed of ardent and stubborn divisions with which to strike new blows. The German losses now affected not only the manpower of the state, but the quality of the army. Never again, by the testimony of many of their own regimental histories, did they fight as they fought on the Somme. Up till this moment Falkenhayn had survived the consequences of his decisions and the malicious strokes of fortune. But his mortal blow was now to come. So, for the German people, though sorely tried and perplexed, had been upbuoyed by the reconstitution of the Eastern Front and the arrest of the British and French upon the Somme. So far OHL could represent that all was proceeding according to plan, but now Germany received a shock for which, though it had long been threatened, She was wholly unprepared. On August 27, Romania declared war. Throughout the winter of 1915 and far on into the summer of 1916, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had been marooned at Kovno. They disposed of 4 armies. Large local battles had been fought upon their front, but they were outside the stream of events. The World War had left them in a martial solitude. All their efforts to procure new forces for the East had been fruitless. They had watched with foreboding and disapproval Falkenhayn gathering his forces against Verdun, and Conrad gleaning the Eastern Front, for the sake of the Trentino. Shrunken in authority, eclipsed by the brilliant episodes of 1915, they still sang their same old song. You should never go back to the West till you have finished with Russia. Russia is only scorched, not slain. You could have finished her last year, if you had only allowed us to make the great encirclement by the north. But while the dominating episodes of Verdun and the Somme filled all minds, nobody at the Supreme Headquarters paid much attention to Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Brusilov's victory had startled German military opinion. No one had believed that such an event could happen. No doubt OHL was dealing deftly with the emergency. Still, there must have been serious miscalculation somewhere. Perhaps after all, these Eastern generals, the men of Tannenberg, were right when they cried repeatedly, "Finish with Russia." The entry of Romania as a German foe opened all men's eyes. Here was a small country desperately anxious to find the winning side, which in the 3rd year of the war, even in the face of the Serbian reckoning, now staked its all upon the ultimate victory of France, Russia, and England. Less than a year had passed since Bulgaria had expressed in arms the contrary opinion. What had happened in the 9 months to make so great a difference in German military credit? The battles, on the whole, had gone well. The public was saturated with tales of captured prisoners, cannon, and territory. Yet Romania clearly thought that Germany was going to lose the war. The German armies had fulfilled every task set them. Someone had set them the wrong tasks. And thus there fell upon Falkenhayn a cataract of instructed or half-instructed displeasure. A tremor almost of panic swept the governing circles. The Crown Prince had expressed his views more than a year ago. They had certainly not been altered by the slaughters before Verdun, the responsibility for which had been unjustly thrown upon him. The Kaiser must have gone through great stresses to cast aside the accomplished, masterly Falkenhayn, the man who had retrieved the Marne and Lemberg. It was an awe-stirring act of state. Nevertheless, borne forward upon a tide of fierce opinion, William II took the right decision. On August 28, Hindenburg and Ludendorff were summoned to Berlin. That night the chief of the Imperial Military Cabinet informed Falkenhayn that the Kaiser had decided to seek independent military advice. The Kaiser's letter to Falkenhayn tells its own tale. August 28, 1916. The chief of my military cabinet has informed me that you feel obliged to regard it as a sign of mistrust to which you cannot submit, that I should consult F. M. Hindenburg as to the present situation. You have also given expression to this standpoint in regard to myself in this evening's conversation. I can understand this from a theoretical point of view, as it is formally consistent with the position of trust of the Chief of the General Staff. I, however, as the Supreme Commander, to whom ultimately the Chief of the General Staff is himself subordinate, must claim to hear, when and as often as it seems right to me, the views of other high commanders in whom I have particular confidence, especially in so serious a situation as the present. But since I must fear that a constant source of dissension and friction is inherent in this conception of mine, I cannot, to my deepest regret, go against your wish to be relieved of your appointment. Meanwhile, I thank you with a much moved heart for all that you have accomplished in these 2 years of war, and I request you, until I have finally decided upon your successor, to continue your service. It will also be my care that your wish to find appropriate employment at the front shall be fulfilled. Your well-disposed and grateful King, William. Thus did the Easterners win the last round of their long duel. Hindenburg and Ludendorff absorbed OHL. The massive figure of the aged field marshal occupied the supreme military seat. At his side as vicegerent, all-grasping, all-using, tireless and hazard-loving, General Ludendorff seized the control of Germany's destiny. Hoffmann would be left in the East. For the East indeed no better choice could have been made. Yet now that we know so much that was hidden, it seems that a great triumvirate was broken when that wise mind was separated from Ludendorff's force and Hindenburg's prestige. Falkenhayn was sent against Romania. All through the autumn the Stavka steadily backed Brusilov. As the Germans gradually arrived upon the broken front, the Russian attacks became increasingly costly and barren. Nevertheless, they were continued with the ruthless prodigality of new hope. The Russian operations were broadened by new offensive battles upon the northern wing of the original attack. Heavy and bloody fighting raged along the Stockhot throughout July, August, and September. The Russian generals strove to make flesh and blood achieve the purposes of artillery. Wire entanglements, which there were no shells to cut, were traversed upon the heaps of dead which the German machine guns piled upon them. This profusion in the commanders was equaled by the devotion of their troops. The Russian effort persisted in loyal accord with the British battles on the Somme and the Scarpe. The waste of human life in these unnoticed fields was scarcely exceeded in any period of the war. Brusilov's actual offensive had, up till the time when the front was stabilized, cost him 350,000 casualties. Against this he might set his equal number of Austrian prisoners, and probably an additional 250,000 enemy killed and wounded. But the whole campaign in the southern theater, following in the wake of his offensive, involved Russian losses which approached 1,000,000. Against these there were no proportionate German casualties. Nevertheless, such was the indomitable vigor of the Russian operations in these months that the German and Austrian forces in the east were raised under constant pressure from 1,300 to 1,800 battalions, an increase of 530 battalions, with all other arms in like proportion, while the German army in the west met the Anglo-French attacks at a uniform strength of approximately 1,300 battalions. This was the last effective military operation undertaken by the armies of the Tsar. The rest of the year witnessed the second of the great German recoveries. Although not on the same vast scale as after Lemberg and the Marne, the paroxysm of German war energy manifested at the end of 1916 astounded the Allies. London and Paris had been led to believe that the Germans were in extreme distress upon the Somme, that Austria had been mortally stricken by Brusilov, and that the Romanian declaration was the beginning of the end. Instead, they were to endure, before the end of 1917, the total destruction of their small new ally, the final collapse of Russia, and the rout of Italy at Caporetto. Although the preliminary arrangements to cope with Romania had been foreseen and prepared by Falkenhayn, were in fact executed by him in person, the credit of that act of retribution was naturally ascribed to the new commanders. I have, in an earlier volume, described in some detail the campaign which overran Romania, destroyed or scattered her armies, occupied her capital, and drove the remnants of the Romanian state to shelter and to starve through a cruel winter within the Russian lines in Bessarabia. the swift ruin of Romania produced almost the same consternation among the Allies as her arrival in the field had created in Berlin. This little country seemed to have been quite fruitlessly consumed. Indeed, the only result of her immolation was a most inconvenient extension of the Russian front by more than 400 miles, and the diversion of nearly 20 Russian divisions. Bucharest fell on December 6, and the Somme battle subsided in the frost and sleet of December. The time was now come for the Emperor Francis Joseph to die. He had witnessed with frigid satisfaction the vast recoil of Russia in 1915. The dismissal of the Grand Duke Nicholas from the command of the Russian armies had seemed to him a signal of Teutonic victory more indubitable even than the fall of Warsaw. He had followed with measured approval the overripe but at last condign chastisement of Serbia. He had welcomed the Kaiser on his way to the celebration of that joyous event. All was then a feast of mutual congratulation. Yet intimate observers had noticed that the high spirits of both potentates had seemed rather forced, and Baron Maguti, to whose records we are indebted, felt at the same time that both really wanted peace. They looked upon victory as the means of gaining peace, not, like their generals, as the means of further victories. They had preoccupations not shared by their servants. Nations may fall and rise again, but dynasties in modern times can only stand or fall. Still, at the beginning of 1916, the sun shone so brightly on the bristling bayonets of the Central Empires that the general staffs were everywhere in the ascendant. Falkenhayn, it was said, had new wonders to produce, and Conrad too, as we have seen, had his plans. The emperor lived long enough to endure the news of Brusilov's offensive, to receive the Romanian declaration of war which he had so long dreaded, to see Falkenhayn, the glittering deliverer of the spring, dismissed by the Kaiser in the autumn. The old man's inveterate pessimism and deeply ingrained expectation of misfortune returned with doubled force. How often had he not seen these false dawns before? True, the Prussian military flame seemed unquenchable, and Romania was already suffering the penalty of her faithlessness. But the clouds had gathered again. The summer of success had been bright, but also brief. Evidently, as he had always been convinced, and so often declared, the road was to be uphill to the very end. The end had now come for him. Since the war began, he had scarcely been seen in public. He refused all holidays and ploughed methodically through his daily routine at Schönbrunn. The care of the court chamberlain had forbidden the park before the imperial windows to be public. It was widely rumored that the emperor was already dead, and was being preserved as a fetish and a symbol. Unpleasant details about the social and economic life of the peoples were sedulously kept from him, but his immense experience enabled him to understand better than his courtiers or his generals how grave the food shortage and popular discontents had become, and when his prime minister, Count Stürk, was pistoled to death by the son of the leader of the Democratic Party, Francis Joseph formed a perfectly clear resolve to make peace as soon as possible. He determined to make peace at any means at latest in the spring of 1917. As a first step, he replaced his murdered minister by a politician of the left, Körber, a man who was honored by the hungry millions and distrusted by the well-fed tens of thousands. This was his last contribution to the affairs of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Bronchitis at 85 is always serious. The emperor coughed much and passed bad nights. Nevertheless, the dawn of November 20th saw him already seated in his old blue uniform at his writing desk. It was the practice to send him 3 portfolios a day. The first was punctually discharged. Before the second was completed, his condition of weakness and fever was such that his granddaughter brought him a special blessing from the Pope and persuaded him to receive the sacraments. 4 chickens were made into a broth for him at noon. He could not eat it, but the midday files were duly dispatched to the departments. In the afternoon the doctors succeeded in inducing him to go to bed. He rose from his table, but had to be supported to the neighboring room. The immense fatigue of years of care overwhelmed him. Sleep and death drew quickly near. With an effort he said to his valet, "Call me at 7. I am behindhand with my work," and sank almost immediately into coma. The departments inquired about the evening portfolio. The aide-de-camp on duty replied that it would not be delivered that night. A few hours later, the 66 years' reign of Francis Joseph was completed. He died in harness. Although the war weighed oppressively upon Vienna, the funeral of the departed ruler was magnificent. The populace, sorely tried, silent, helpless, hungry, understood that a long chapter in the history of Central Europe had closed. New pages must be turned. Nay, a new volume must open. The aged Count Parr would not see this volume. "I died yesterday," he said to Maguti, on the morrow of his master's death. In fact, he expired during the memorial service 2 days later. The ties of a lifetime which had been snapped were also the heartstrings of this faithful servitor. But the war rolled on.